Have you ever walked out of a conversation just feeling completely drained, confused, maybe even questioning your own reality? Not because you lost an argument, but because the argument itself just turned into this endless maze with no way out. Well, that's what we're talking about today. It's a really powerful and honestly pretty invisible dynamic called the Nuance Trap. We're going to look at how the very act of trying to be a reasonable person, of trying to see all sides, can be twisted and used to make you feel like you're losing your grip. The most striking truth about what's called analytical overload is that your intelligence is not your shield. It is the very tool used to dismantle you. Now, I know that sounds completely backward, right? We're always taught that our ability to think, to reason, to be logical, and that's our greatest strength. But in certain dynamics, a controller doesn't need to outsmart you. They just need to make you think too much until your brain basically runs out of power. And that really brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. Why does simply trying to be reasonable in a discussion so often end with you feeling like you're going crazy? This is the paradox of the Nuance Trap. It's that moment your own high-functioning prefrontal cortex and your deep desire for things to make sense are turned into the very mechanism of your own psychological collapse. It's not a failure of your intellect, it's a hijacking of it. So, how are we going to unpack all of this? We've got a roadmap. First, we'll look at how your mind gets weaponized. Then, we'll talk about what it actually feels like to be drowning in nuance. We'll break down the specific overload mechanism they use, dig into the psychology of why it's so effective, and then, this is the important part, we'll cover how you can reclaim your clarity and your right to simplicity. All right, so let's jump in. Part 1, your mind weaponized. You have to understand, this is not a battle of wits. The person creating this overload isn't trying to outlogic you. They're using your own logic against you. Think of it less like a chess match and more like a war of attrition. They don't have to make a brilliant point to win. All they have to do is keep the conversation complicated and spinning long enough to completely drain your brain's processing power. They don't win by being right, they win by wearing you out. And let's get this straight from the jump. If this has happened to you, it is not a sign that you've failed intellectually. It's a sign that your brain's executive functions, the part that handles focus, planning, and keeping your emotions in check, have been deliberately run down. Think of your mental energy like a phone battery. A good conversation might use a little power, maybe even charge it. But this is like being forced to run a chaotic energy-hogging app until your battery hits 0 and the screen goes dark. So, what does it actually feel like when you're in the middle of this? Let's dissect the feeling, the anatomy of the confusion. Because drowning isn't just some vague metaphor. It's created by a few specific, identifiable tactics. It all starts with something called narrative proliferation. Here's how it works. You ask a simple question, why were you late? And instead of a simple answer, you get a tidal wave of stories, details, emotional histories, and different perspectives. Suddenly, your brain, which is wired to find patterns, gets a 1,000-piece puzzle thrown at it. But the pieces are from 10 different boxes. It's just impossible to make sense of it. It's overload by design. And that leads right to this feeling of contextual drowning. You know this feeling. You started the conversation with a clear point, like, I'm upset you didn't call. And 45 minutes later, you find yourself debating their childhood, the pressures of their job, and the philosophical meaning of a promise. You're so saturated with all this stuff that you completely forget why you were upset in the first place. Your original point is just gone, lost in the fog. And all of this builds to something called linguistic vertigo. And I mean this literally. It can be a physical sensation of dizziness, of disorientation. Your brain gets so bombarded with circular logic and endless words that it just quits. It's a protective shutdown. And in that moment of surrender, you'll pretty much agree to anything just to make the mental static finally stop. Now, look at the power dynamic this creates. It's a total rewrite of how a conversation is supposed to work. One person becomes the narrator. Their job is easy. Just keep creating the story, spinning the complex web. It takes very little energy. But you're forced into the role of the auditor. You have to listen, analyze, fact-check, and try to make logical sense of pure chaos. You're doing all the heavy lifting, all the logical labor, while they just keep talking. It's completely unbalanced. Okay, so we get the feeling, but how is it actually created? Well, it's not random. There's a repeatable 3-step pattern that's like the engine for this whole thing. We can call it the 3-step takedown. And once you see the pattern, you can start to disarm it. Here's how it works. Step 1 is the nuance pivot. You ask a simple yes or no question. Instead of yes or no, they pivot into a long monologue about how complicated the situation is. Step 2 is the semantic loop. Suddenly, you're not talking about what they did or didn't do anymore. You're debating the meaning of their words or the tone you used. You're stuck in a loop analyzing their language, not their actions. And finally, step 3, cognitive surrender. Once you're exhausted, they offer a simple self-serving summary like, so we agree it's really about our communication, and your brain is so tired, you just agree to make it stop. Now, the long-term damage of this cycle is really insidious. It trains your brain to think that complexity equals intelligence. The person who can spin the most confusing stories starts to seem deep, and your desire for a simple, clear answer, well, that starts to feel shallow or even aggressive. You actually start to feel bad for wanting clarity, and that's the trap. So we've covered the what and the how, but why? Why does this work so incredibly well, especially on smart, thoughtful people? This goes deeper than just a clever trick. It plugs right into our psychology. Here's the fundamental conflict. The controller's goal is something we can call accountability immunity. If they can make every issue infinitely complex, then nothing can ever really be proven. And if nothing can be proven, nothing is ever their fault. This goal attacks your biggest vulnerability, your need for intellectual integrity. You want to be fair, you want to see all sides, and that desire, which is a virtue in almost any other situation, gets weaponized to stop you from holding a simple boundary. And it all comes back to biology. Executive function depletion is a neurological fact. Your prefrontal cortex, your thinking brain, literally runs on glucose. It's a finite resource. And when you're forced into these long, draining circular arguments, you are literally burning through your brain's fuel. When that fuel runs out, your ability to think critically just plummets. Your confusion isn't a character flaw, it's a biological state. Your brain is just out of juice. Okay, so now for the most important part of this whole thing. Understanding the trap is one thing, but how do you actually get out of it? How do you take back your mental clarity and your right to a straight answer? Let's talk about some real, practical tools. There are 2 really powerful things you can do, even right in the middle of one of these conversations. First, do a private signal-to-noise audit. Just ask yourself, is this explanation actually adding clarity, the signal, or is it just adding more confusion, the noise? A good way to check is to ask, could this 20-minute speech have been a 2-sentence answer? Second, do a baseline reset. This means you consciously decide to ignore the big, complicated story they're telling you, and you focus only on the simple, observable action. Trust what you see over the story you're being told. And really, underneath both of these tools is a core belief you have to give yourself permission to have. You can even use it as a silent mantra. I am allowed to have a simple answer. This isn't about being ignorant or demanding less information. It's a demand for respect. It's you reclaiming your right to not get pulled into a game that's designed to exhaust you. That one single thought can break the whole cycle. So let's bring this all home. What's the final lesson here? What do we take away from understanding the nuance trap? It's really about redefining our relationship with complexity and, more importantly, our right to clarity. Here's the bottom line. While life really is complex, manufactured complexity is usually just a place to bury a simple truth. It's a smokescreen. So if you take one thing away from all of this, let it be this. Clarity is a basic right in any healthy relationship. It is not an intellectual luxury you have to earn by fighting your way through someone else's chaos. You have a right to a simple answer. And that brings us to the final thought. The way out of the nuance trap isn't to think harder, it's actually to stop playing the overthinking game entirely, and instead to just start trusting what you see with your own 2 eyes. Stop analyzing the 1,000-word explanation for what happened and just see the simple, observable thing that happened. Stop thinking so much, start seeing.